Great. Welcome to all those that are on the line to the Science-Based Target Setting webinar for the Maritime Transport Public Consultation webinar. We thank you so much for your time today and looking forward to engage with the material. Next slide, please. So to start the webinar, just some webinar etiquette and rules. Just ensure that you are connected to your audio through your computer or dial-in numbers. We have a dedicated Q&A window that we kindly ask that you can enter your typed questions and comments throughout the webinar. We will be verbally discussing and answering some questions that are posted in the Q&A box in a dedicated Q&A slot at the end of the webinar, and we'll aim to answer as many questions in a written format throughout the webinar. The slides and the recording from this meeting will also be shared with all registered attendees after this call. And the call is recorded for those that are unable to join and for record-keeping purposes. Next slide, please. The agenda for today's 1-hour call covers 5 topics. I will start us off with a welcome and introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Thereafter, I'll hand off to my colleagues for an overview of the Maritime Transport Guidance, as well as a dive into the target setting tool. Thereafter, we will discuss the call for inputs as well as next steps, and then we will end the webinar with a dedicated Q&A slot. Next slide, please. For today's speakers, we've got 5 colleagues on the line from Smart Freight Center, UMass, as well as WWF. I'm joined on the line by my WWF colleague, Fernando, who's the Senior Technical Manager based at Mexico. We also have Jean-Marc from UMass on the line, as well as Alan and Dan from SFC. Alan is the Technical Development Director and Dan is the Senior Technical Manager. We will delve into what and how these organizations have played a part during the public consultation and sector development phase. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to kick us off with a grounding of what are science-based targets and what we're aiming to resolve through the sector development is that science-based targets are greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, and they are considered to be science-based if they are in line with what the latest climate science says is necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. That is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So in simple terms, science-based targets delineates by how much and how quickly a company needs to decarbonize to align with the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative is an unprecedented collaboration between 4 leading NGOs, CDP, United Nations Global Compact, WWF, and the World Resources Institute. And we focus on driving ambitious corporate climate action through companies setting targets aligned with climate science. Since our inception in 2015, we have gained a lot of momentum, and over 1,200 companies have formally joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative's call to action. And of the sample, over 630 companies have got approved targets in place. Next slide, please. So the process that companies can join is a 6-step process that's outlined on the slide. The first step that many companies take is committing to set science-based targets, which is shown on the left-hand side of the screen. And this is a public commitment where companies say that they're pledging to set science-based targets within a 24-month period. The second step is modeling targets using science-based target resources and methodologies. And this is where we are concentrating on this step at the moment during this maritime transport sector development, where we've developed a sector-specific methodology allowing maritime transport-related companies to set nuanced targets for science-based target setting that is relevant for their sector. Thereafter, companies submit their proposed science-based targets to the initiative to get validated, wherein they're assessed to see if they are in line with our criteria and best practice for us to ascertain whether they can be determined to be science-based. Should a company be approved, the targets will be publicly announced on our website as well as our partner website. Do you mind going back a slide? Thank you. Once companies have got their targets announced, the implementation side comes into play, wherein companies have measures and projects in place to implement their targets and on an annual basis track and disclose their progress. So this is the route that many companies take, and we will be doing a deep dive into what it means specifically for maritime transport companies. If you're interested in more information on the step-by-step process, we encourage you to explore the relevant resources available on our website. Next slide, please. For the project, we have had a particular objective, and that is to develop target setting tools and guidance for inspiring ambitious action on maritime transport emissions across a range of different stakeholders that takes into account best greenhouse gas reporting practices and long-term decarbonization pathways. And this project objective has been overlain by 3 project deliverables. The blue segment is what has been underlying the project deliverables, and that is to develop carbon intensity reduction pathways aligned with a well below 2C scenario and a 1.5C scenario for the shipping sector. That includes different disaggregated pathways for different types of categories or vessel types. This is captured in our practical target setting tool, which is the Excel-based tool we will be delving into, as well as the complementary greenhouse gas accounting and target setting guidance document that we will also be discussing. Next slide, please. For the project team structure, as mentioned and you've seen with the speakers that we have today, this has been a collaborative process between WWF, Smart Freight Center and UMass, as well as with participation and collaboration with our technical working group. The project management has been led by WWF, with our technical partners of Smart Freight Center and UMass leading on the technical development. And then we've been in collaboration throughout the project duration, seeking input from our technical working group, which is a group of sector experts and representatives from companies interested in science-based target setting and that are of relevance for the maritime transport sector. And where we are now is in this gray bar around the broader stakeholder ecosystem and public consultation phase. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand over to my colleagues that will take us through the next agenda items.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. I'm Alan Lewis, Technical Director at Smart Freight Center. And I think to start with, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the way that science-based targets and the maritime sector both fit into the bigger picture. So The Maritime Sector Science-Based Targets Initiative guidance and tool that are the subject of this consultation form part of a broader suite of SBTi guidances in the same way that shipping is an integral part of the broader global transport sector, whether that's for the transport of people or of goods. And to put that into context, I'll start by sharing a few freight sector statistics. So if you could click on. According to the International Transport Forum, international shipping comprises around 72% of global freight transport activity, whilst contributing 27% of freight transport greenhouse gas emissions. And taken together, these values show the importance of shipping in absolute terms and its contribution to freight transport.
Alan.
Sorry, I hope I'm back now. Can we go back a second? Sorry, a bit of an
Yeah,
unstable internet connection there, unfortunately. The relatively low emission intensity is no reason for shipping to rest on its laurels. With forecasts of potential tripling of sea freight transport activity by 2050 and pressure to reduce total greenhouse gas emissions, further significant reductions in emission intensity will need to be found in the short term, together with a move to zero emission operation by 2050 or sooner. The Science Based Targets Initiative has a key role to play in driving this change. Next slide, please. The need for urgent sector action is borne out by the ITF's business as usual predictions of shipping's increased share of freight transport emissions by 2050, as new trade routes open and existing supply chains continue to lengthen in that business as usual scenario. Next slide, please. There are many initiatives working together to improve the transparency of greenhouse gas emission reporting and to make it easier for companies to target and track the changes due to their emission reduction strategies. In developing these guidelines, we've endeavoured to maintain this harmonisation with, for example, the GLEC framework, CDP, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and planning for the forthcoming ISO 14083 standard, which is expected to be released at the end of 2022. Next slide, please. And we also aim for comprehensive coverage of the emission accounting process. This includes the positioning of shipping in amongst all modes within the supply chain, the full consideration of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, all the greenhouse gases that are considered by the UNFCCC, and looking at full fuel cycle emissions, so taking into account both fuel production, distribution, as well as end use emissions. This stretches beyond the scope of current IMO targets to ensure that actions taken don't merely shift emissions from the transport sector away to the energy sector, but leave the emissions in the overall economy, in order to fully address this issue in a holistic way. Next slide, please. And here you can see the key position of target setting within the four-step process that we envisage that everybody can participate in, taking credible emission calculation and reporting into the target setting process, and then using that to drive both emission reduction and collaboration. And I wanted to finish before passing on to my colleagues who will speak in more detail about the guidelines themselves by emphasizing the need for comprehensive emission reduction plans that address the full picture of avoid, shift, and improve, together with fuel decarbonisation. and the responsibility that we all have to bring this about. I'm now going to pass on to Dan Smith, my colleague, Senior Technical Manager at Smart Freight Centre, who's going to talk in more detail about the guidelines.
Great, thank you, Alan. Fernando, are you willing to jump us ahead on the slides? Thanks. So as Rebecca mentioned in the introductory parts of the presentation, one of the outputs of this project is an accounting and target setting guidance document. And that guidance document really addresses 4 objectives. First, it provides readers with information on emission reduction target setting that's focused specifically on the maritime transport sector. So this is seen as a tool to build on the existing SBTi transport guidance that addresses other modes. Second, the guidance provides a brief overview of emissions accounting methods and practices as they relate to emissions target setting. Third, the guidance provides a brief overview of SBTi target setting methods. And then fourth, the guidance also really serves as a detailed how-to tool for calculating and preparing the required user inputs into the target setting tool itself that Fernando is going to run us through a little bit later today. Now, I should note that this target setting guidance document and the tool are both available on the SBTi website. They went live yesterday with the official opening of the public consultation period. So the guidance that I'm referring to and the Excel-based tool are both publicly available now for your review and assessment. Next slide, please. So the guidance and the tool are really focused on 2 key user groups, for lack of a better term. On one hand, we have the carriers. These are the vessel owner operators that are actually providing marine transportation services with their assets. And in most cases, we're going to expect the carriers to be using the tool to set scope 1 emission reduction targets. And in the other bucket, we have shippers and logistics service providers. These are organizations that are hiring or contracting with carriers to transport cargo by sea on their behalf. And in most cases, for the shippers and the logistics service providers, we expect those organizations to be using this tool to set scope 3 or their supply chain emission reduction targets. Now, when it comes to actual user inputs into the tool, the guidance document provides specific instructions for both of these user groups, for the carriers and the shippers and the logistics service providers, when it comes to selecting vessel size categories, calculating transport activity, and calculating base year emissions. And Fernando is going to talk about some of those user inputs here in a little bit. Could we go to the next slide, please? Yes, okay, so I want to reiterate a point on this emissions concept that Alan touched on briefly in his overview of where this all sits in the world of transport emissions. And that's about the full life cycle emissions of fuels. As is outlined in the GLEC framework, and as Alan mentioned, the tool and the guidance focus on the full fuel life cycle for emissions from marine fuels. That is, they focus on the well to wake emissions of a fuel. Now, the well to wake emissions of the fuel is built on really 2 components: the well to tank portion, which includes fuel production and distribution related emissions, and then the tank to wake portion, which is focused on emissions that are generated during the combustion of a marine fuel. Now, this is a key point for us to keep in mind as we work forward with this tool, because as I think I saw in one of these questions coming up a little bit earlier today, the IMO emissions factors are focused at this point in time only on the tank to wake portion of a fuel's emissions life cycle. So we need to keep that in mind if or companies who are setting targets using the tool and might be looking to the 4th IMO greenhouse gas study for emission factors. It's important to remember that those emission factors are tank to wake only. The tool and the guidance are focused on well to wake. And it's also important for us to remember this full life cycle of a fuel's emissions footprint when we start thinking about the emissions budgets for the maritime sector. And my colleague Jean's going to talk more about the budgets in a moment. After hitting on the budgets themselves, he's also going to run us through the transport demand projections and sector intensity pathways that have fed into the tool. So with that, I will turn it over to Jean from UMass.
Thank you very much, Dan, and everyone. As Dan just said, I'm Jean-Marc Bonello, one of the consultants at UMass who have been helping SBTi on this maritime tool on the technical side. So our job in this project was to come up with the actual foundation of this tool, that is the carbon intensity trajectories for the industry. And for those who are not familiar with how these trajectories come about, basically they're made up of two base components. So we've got a carbon budget, which is basically a time series of carbon budget into the future, which the industry is allowed to have in order to align to some target. In this case, as was previously said, we've got the well below 2 and 1.5 degree targets, and also the transport work demand. One has to project the amount of transport work that will be needed in the future for the global economy to keep working. And with those two elements together, we can come up with a reasonable carbon intensity trajectory. So here I wanted to introduce the main sources of data that were used when we came up with these carbon intensity trajectories. For the carbon budget, we had two main sources, starting with the well below 2 degrees. We used the IEA's Energy Technology Perspectives, the ETP from 2017, which had outlined a well below 2 degree scenario for shipping with an accompanying carbon budget. For the 1.5 degree scenario, which is sort of the most important one, in our eyes, we sort of went back to the actual Ipcc 1.5 degree report and sort of took it word for word from there. So there we've got the 45% reduction that is put in there by 2030, and then going towards decarbonization by 2050. On the transport work demand front, we used the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study, which was published in autumn last year. So there we have the OECD-based transport work demand projections. That is based on one of the sort of middle of the road scenarios. If obviously you're more interested in that, you can have a look at that or ask any questions later on. But basically, those are the data sources that were used to come up with the trajectories. Fernando, if you could go to the next slide, please. So starting off with the carbon budgets, here you'll see we've got that time series that I just mentioned. So we've got 3 lines on the plot on the left of the screen there. So we've got the blue line, which is the below 2 degrees scenario coming from ETP 2017. We've got the purple line, which is the Ipcc 1.5 degree trajectory, which takes us to decarbonization of the industry at 2050. And as you see, we included also the IMO 2050 target. So just to make sure that we're identify that target. So that is the absolute emission reduction target. That is of at least 50% on 2008 levels by 2050. As Dan pointed out previously, the emissions considered by the IMO in the 2050 target are only the operational emissions, or as we were using the terminology, the tank to wake emissions. So that's why, unlike the other trajectories, which are actually considering well-to-wake targets, the IMO itself only considers operational targets. Therefore, all of the emissions will basically be shifted upstream. And that's why we see the emissions increase actually rather than decrease. So that's something that I wanted to make clear, and please ask any questions if that is not clear. One other thing that came out of the IMO study, basically all of the work that the IMO does is, besides it being operational, it only considers CO2, and we don't have any upstream emissions included there. So we had to estimate them in some way. In order to fill in that gap, we refer to the Zero Emissions Vessels Transition Pathway document that UMass ourselves worked with Lloyd's on in 2019 to consider some potential different fuels to be used in the future. Obviously, different studies will offer different projections for different fuel uptake. So in this case, we decided to go in a sort of middle of the road scenario where we've got a relatively equal distribution of different fuels. So biofuels, electrofuels, and so on. So that's what that chart is showing down on the right. And so basically, this is what we got, where we got the carbon budget for the sector for those two trajectories. If you can go to the next slide, Fernando. Now coming back to the transport demand. Now again, this came from the fourth greenhouse gas study. And as you can see, we've got an increase in transport demand, as you would expect into the future, going towards 2050. Again, for more details, please refer to the greenhouse gas study or ask any questions. One thing that I wanted to point out with this chart specifically is that when we went into the vessel type specific emissions trajectories, we don't differentiate the transport demand changes for the different sectors, but took it as a constant increase. So that is something that we wanted to make sure is clear, and we'll gladly take questions on that later on. So with those two pieces of data, the carbon budget, the transport demand projection, we can go to the next slide, Fernando, please. With those two building blocks, we come up with the carbon intensity trajectory. So this is the overall carbon intensity trajectory for the shipping industry, considering the overall budget and the transport work projection. So here, as you can see, the carbon intensity is in grams of CO2 equivalent per ton nautical mile of work. And again, we always keep we've got our two trajectories, so the 1.5 degree and well below 2 degrees, but also keep the IMO 2050 line there, just to show that, especially if we're looking at the whole well-to-wake consideration and for CO2 equivalent, the IMO 2050 target doesn't cater for decarbonization at all or anywhere close to the Paris Agreement. So therefore, sort of, we've got those two trajectories, which the tool for the SBTi is built upon. I know that was very quick, and I'm sure there's lots of questions which I'm seeing, which I'll do my best effort to answer. But also, I'll be around for the Q&A to answer any questions later on. So I'll pass it on to Fernando, who will explain a bit more about how the tool actually works.
And thank you very much, John-Mark. So in this next section, we're gonna show you what the purpose of the tool is. My colleagues have already explained the nature of the guidance document, and as usual, as part of our suite of resources for helping companies set targets, the Science-Based Target Initiative has made available a number of specialized tools over the years, starting with tools aimed at industrial sectors. Previously, and also in collaboration with the Smart Freight Center, we had developed a tool addressing road and rail transport emissions. Actually, that tool has been quite extensively used by freight companies and also by automakers to define targets for the use of solid products of their vehicles. And we're taking a very similar approach. We build a tool that's an Excel-based document that calculates science-based targets for a variety of vessel types and sizes uh, as Jean-Marc explained, using the IMO greenhouse gas study breakdown or classification as the basis for all of these different pathways, intensity decarbonization pathways. So each of those vessel types and sizes are available in your tool, as well as an option for aimed mostly at the logistics service providers and shippers that may not know the details in terms of vessel size for their maritime transport operations. So this is basically this is a very simple interface for calculating all of each of these maritime transport categories, and it has one additional feature, which is what we are calling the SBT aggregator. And this aggregator is actually useful because a lot of companies will have to model targets, more than one target according to their activities. But as you can imagine, communicating multiple targets can be confusing for your stakeholders. So we are adding this aggregator feature to help companies combine these targets across multiple maritime transport categories into a single intensity metric by prorating the rate of reduction in terms of their base year activity shares for each category. So this is an optional feature, and it will be relevant for companies that have more than one category, either more than one vessel type or size. So this is what the tool does. It takes into account all intensity pathways that our colleagues at UMass developed um, along 1.5C and well below 2C trajectories for all of these combinations of type and size, and uh, and these default pathways where the user might not know the ship size, the vessel size. It will ask for a simplified company input, which consists of a base year and base year activity data, and it will provide you automatically with the results aligned with the 1.5C scenario and the well below 2C scenario, both calculated using the convergence approach, or as we call it in the initiative, the sectoral decarbonization approach. This approach is the exact same approach that we have used in the past for all of the other transport categories. So the tool out there that's for road and rail, it's already applying the SDA, or industrial tool, or SBTi tool for industrial sectors also applies the SDA, which proposes that a company needs to converge to the sector required intensity in the target year, in this case 2050. Um, and the target intensity will also be influenced by the relative base year intensity of that company relative to the sector, and the relative growth of that company against the sector. So those two factors play a role in determining how fast and how much a company needs to decarbonize. And that approach is applied for both the scenarios. As you can see in the sample results, and this is just mock-up data, you can see companies that are above the sector and that they will have a much different trajectory depending on the level of ambition that they are aiming for. And I guess, yeah, in simple terms, what this comes down to is a simple four-step process where once you have access to the tool, which is already available on our website, as all of our SBTi tools are, you can download them, you can use them. Or draft maritime transport tool is still not approved for use, but you can already test it and send us your feedback through the survey, and Rebecca will tell you about that process for getting feedback. You can download our other tools as well, which might help you with other type of missions in your company. And they all work in a very similar way. First, you need to define what type of activity you want to model, and input the base and target year. This target time frame has to comply with our criteria of being anywhere between 5 and 15 years from the ongoing year, so the year that you submit a target to us. And You will need to enter then the activity level in that base year, ideally a year where you have a full inventory, and the well to wheel emissions for that inventory, which will span across your scopes 1 and 3, um, scope 3, category 3. That is broken down for each transport activity that you want to model. Then you need to enter for the target year data, the expected activity level. So that would be in ton nautical miles, or for the in the case of ferry passenger and cruises, it will be on a gross ton nautical miles, same as the base year. And finally, once you scroll down in the tool, you'll get to see those graphs and tables with the target setting results, and you will be able to formulate a target which would go along the lines of my company commits to reduce well-to-wake GHG emissions 30% in grams of CO2 equivalent per ton nautical mile, or as I mentioned in this other unit for passenger operations, um, um, by 2035 from a 2020 base year. So that is basically what a target wording. This is a template that we recommend. This is essentially what your target will be, how your target will be communicated and approved by the initiative after these resources are approved. And with that, I just want to invite you to download our tool, test it, and help us with your feedback on our survey. Thank you. And I will hand it back to Rebecca. Any questions on the tool and its applicability? We'll have a time for Q&A not answered in the chat box at the end of this webinar. Thank you, and back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Fernando. So for the last section before we delve into a dedicated Q&A time, I'll just briefly go over our call for inputs from the stakeholder group and folks on the call, as well as next steps of the project and how to get involved in submitting comments. Next slide, please. So the process to provide feedback, our guidance document that has been presented by Dan, the tool by Fernando, as well as the online survey to capture comments is all live on the Science Based Targets Initiative website. Following the call, when we distribute the recording, we'll also ensure that we distribute the link, the direct link to provide comments. And the slides will have the link in as well. So we have a preferential feedback method, so it's purely through the online survey form that has dedicated questions, as well as a question at the end for open comments and feedback. Our emails are included at the end of the slide, so if you have any questions, please let us know. As previously mentioned, the public consultation period opened yesterday and will be open for 3 weeks. So we will be accepting comments via the online survey up until the close of business on Friday, the 16th of April. And just to note, we will consider all feedback from that is provided by stakeholders during the public consultation phase. However, all perspectives may not be reflected in the final deliverables, as it still needs to go through an internal review process within the decision-making body of the Science Based Targets Initiative. Next slide, please. So where we are today is on the second point. We opened the public consultation yesterday, holding the webinar today with a 3-week consultation period happening until the close of business on April 16th. This is our illustrative timeline. The dates may be subject to change. We will use the second half of April to integrate the feedback received into the guidance document and into the target setting tool. Thereafter, the deliverables will be submitted to the Science-Based Targets Technical Working Group for input, as well as input, feedback, and approval by the Science-Based Targets Steering Committee. We are aiming for a final launch of the deliverables that will then be able to be used by our user group around May or June. So definitely keep your eye on the Science-Based Target Initiative website for any updates. And you can also sign up to our newsletter through our website and stay up to date with any news surrounding the project. Next slide, please. I think that may be the last one. Great. So just to reiterate, we've got about 15 minutes left, but really do encourage all on the call to please submit your feedback. We really would welcome any comments and your thoughts to ensure that our deliverables are as robust as possible. So we're going to open up the Q&A. We will be taking the written questions and answering them verbally amongst the project team, but unfortunately the attendees are unable to be unmuted. So the first question we're going to go over and just reiterate is around the key user group. There have been a number of questions raised in the Q&A box around different user types and whether this methodology will be applicable to them, and who the key audience is for this project. I think I'll hand over to Jean-Marc, and other colleagues, please feel free to unmute and add any additional information. If you don't mind providing comment on that, Jean.
Hi, sorry, Rebecca. I'm going to be completely honest. I was answering another question typing, and I wasn't listening. But could you please repeat the question?
No problem at all. Just to reiterate, please, the key user group or key audience of the methodology, as we've had a couple questions in the Q&A box asking if it's applicable to certain subsectors.
Yes, so we had a question specifically about offshore activities and things sort of service vessels like dredgers. So in the tool specifically, there is only one category that sort of captures some of these less represented, let's say, vessels in the global fleet, which is offshore. For those who are probably familiar with the IMO greenhouse gas study, which is sort of provides the foundation for the carbon intensity numbers that are used in this, works using AIS-derived CO2 estimates based on sort of an estimated engineering model of the vessels. For the larger vessels, we're quite confident. So for the deep sea, let's say deep sea shipping vessels, bulkers, tankers, container ships, and so on, we're quite confident that the methodology behind the IMO greenhouse gas study estimation is robust, given the operating profile is sort of quite standardized for those vessels, and even the actual geometry and the machinery. However, when we go to smaller vessels, and especially the offshore sector, offshore service vessels, installation vessels, things like tugs, anchor handling, and things like that, the operation is a lot more diverse, and there's a lot more heterogeneity in the sectors. So we're not really confident in the data that we get from the IMO greenhouse gas study to come up with to inform those trajectories. So basically, that one sort of offshore category is the best that we could do with that, because this is sort of mostly based on the other vessel types. So yes, that is the question. As you know, any methods based on estimates thrive on homogeneous sectors, such as the bigger vessel sectors, whilst they are quite weak when it comes to more heterogeneous sectors.
Thank you so much for the input and clarification. That's really helpful. And we're going to take another question that's been raised around the timing of the publication of the materials and when companies should start using the materials and which version. I'm just going to scroll to the question. So it's being posted by anonymous attendee. Would you recommend to maritime transport companies to wait for the publication of the final guidance before setting science-based targets? What would be the impact of setting science-based targets now using the regular tool and guidance? Fernando, would you like to take that question, please?
Um, I actually also was typing a different question, and I apologize. Could you kindly repeat me the question again?
No problem. I'm happy to take this one. So the question is around usage of the deliverables and around the timing. So in the time of the public consultation phase, up until the formal public launch of the sector development, the deliverables are still draft, and we recommend that companies test the tool, provide input on the guidance document, and start thinking about what it means to set a science-based target for your company. However, there may be revisions during the public consultation phase when we incorporate different feedback and inputs, subject to the approval of the Science-Based Target Initiative Steering Committee. So we would recommend waiting until the public launch with the final version of the deliverables until companies formally use that to set their targets and submit to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. If anyone would like to add from the project team, you're welcome to. There's also a complementary question around the different methodologies that we have available for companies to set targets. So there's a question that I understand the SDA tools based on an intensity target is absolute target not approved by SBTi for maritime sector.
I can comment on that one.
Sure, thank you.
And I think it's an important thing to acknowledge that the SVTI has reviewed and accepted previously targets from shipping companies, and those targets are expressed in absolute terms, which is acceptable. There is no requirement specifically for shipping companies to have an intensity-based target. Company may want to submit using our absolute contraction approach for their scope 1 and separated for the scope or jointly with their scope 3 category 3. I think the best practice is, of course, to do it on a well-to-wake basis anyhow, but there is no restriction to aim for an absolute contraction target. If a company so decides. The purpose of this guidance and tool is to essentially customize and help bridge the or help connect the rationale of these decarbonization scenarios that are specific about maritime transport operations and demand projections for the sector in a way that are more meaningful or representative of what the sector or what is required for this sector and not from the global economy. Now, this again, out of a personal recommendation, I would suggest that you explore the guidance, explore the tool, and if you decide this is these resources are relevant to your company, that you hold on until the approval according to our timeline, indicative timeline. We expect these resources to become available fairly soon. So I would actually recommend that you wait until these resources are approved. But as always, there is a chance of submitting an absolute target to us at the initiative and get it validated.
Thanks so much for that clarification. I hope it answers your question. We've also had some questions in the chat around the interaction between this proposed methodology and the IMO and the intensity graphs that were shown by different methodologies with IMO and our basis of data that we've used. Jean-Marc, if you wouldn't mind just perhaps reiterating the relationship between what we're proposing in terms of ambition and the thought process, as well as what's on offer by the IMO.
Yes, of course. Rebecca, could I ask, sorry, Fernando, could I ask you to maybe for us to go back to the budget slide, just to have it in front of us. So I knew this would raise lots of questions. So this goes back to the, there we go, thank you. So this goes back to the, now I'm going to address sort of why we're getting lots of questions to see why there's actually an increase rather than a decrease that we can see for the orange line, which is the IMO 2050 target. What I think the main thing that we need to clarify on this chart, that this is a well-to-wake emissions chart in CO2 equivalent. So this includes the upstream emissions as well as the downstream operational emissions, both well-to-wake, sorry, all the well-to-wake, both well-to-tank and tank-to-wake. The IMO 2050 target only includes in that ambition of at least 50% reduction the tank-to-wake emissions. So what we're seeing there is, with the assumptions that were taken with regards to how the fuel mix landscape will evolve in the future, which again, I invite you to go and to look at the documents and references that go with it. Obviously, these are projections, and there's an element of speculation that is going on there, but the strategy that we adopted is to be as transparent as possible to the assumptions that we've taken. So this is what the consultation period is all about, sort of. Please go ahead and dig a bit deeper if you would like. So basically, with the assumptions of fuel mix that we have in the future, although some of those fuels will actually be zero carbon at the point of use, they might still have upstream emissions associated with them. So, for example, if we look at things like biofuels or like e-fuels or synthetic fuels that come about from using LNG as a feedstock, and different feedstock have associated emissions with them. So this is why we see that despite the ambition of the IMO 2050 target to reduce the tank-to-wake emissions by half, it still sees an increase when we look at the well-to-wake emissions. So I hope that clarified it slightly, but if you've still got questions, please consult the technical guidance and get back to us with any questions.
Thanks for reiterating and going over that. That's really helpful. If you wouldn't mind also taking the next question, or other project team members are welcome to jump in. There's a question around, can you please elaborate on the difference between the well below 2 degree ETP 2017 and the 1.5 degree IPCC 1.5 special report, carbon budgets, and the allocation to shipping?
I think the main difference between them is that so with the 1.5 degree, basically it is the bottom-up calculated emissions, well, estimated emissions from the greenhouse, for the 4th greenhouse gas study that are used, and then the proportion that is required to reach 1.5 degrees from the sort of global carbon budget outlined in the IPCC 1.5 document was applied to that budget. In the IEA document, obviously there's a whole other set of assumptions that the IEA took in their study, both from what happens in the global energy mix scenario, as well as how the sector takes into consideration, how the study takes into consideration the different sectoral budget allocations. I'm afraid it's quite an open-ended question, and I would recommend going back to the actual sources to see the difference between those two.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. And as always, we encourage folks to dive into the draft deliverables on our website. We can probably take one or two more questions. We've had a couple questions around finding emission factors, as well as how to calculate greenhouse gas emissions for certain user types. Perhaps I can give this to Alan and just you can go over what's also available around the GLEC framework, if that works for you.
Sure, yeah. So within the GLEC framework, we've tried to pull together a fairly broad collection of both well-to-tank and tank-to-wheel emission factors for a range of fuels. Primarily, they are focused at the moment on conventional, so fossil fuels. And we're actually in process of, in parallel with the work that's going on with the ISO 14083, looking to expand the range of fuels that are included in that list. And that would be not just for the maritime sector, but for fuels that are relevant to other sectors as well. And then it's really just a question of calculating the amount of fuel or the fuel intensity and applying the appropriate emission factors that are aligned with the individual fuels, and then summing that to come up with your the various elements of the fuel life cycle, so the well to tank and the tank to wheel or tank to wake emission elements. But it really comes down to sourcing reliable emission factors.
Thanks, Alan, for that information. We're going to take one more question. I'll hand this over to Jean-Marc. Will the SEC and the Poseidon principles be aligned with this? More importantly, how will this input flow to the IMO? Will this be part of the 2023 review of the initial greenhouse gas strategy? Perhaps you can just offer a couple thoughts before we close on this question.
Yes, thank you for the question. This is really important and interesting because there's many sort of trajectory-based initiatives coming around related to shipping, which sort of it's important to make sure that we understand what all of them are out to do to achieve. So regarding the Chicago Charter and the Poseidon Principles, obviously they are their own initiatives, so they've got their own steering committees, and they will hopefully be following this in some way. Obviously, we would definitely them to take this up because this is more ambitious, as we've shown, than the IMO 2050 target, but obviously that's up to them. With regards to the IMO, I don't know if maybe Fernando knows if the WWF has any intention of inputting this through its seat at the IMO. But I think as it stands currently, there's no formal plans, at least from SBTi side. If I'm wrong, please correct me, Fernando.
Well, as SBTi, we don't engage with policy development directly. We encourage companies to do that as well. WWF does have a channel and a seat at as observers in the IMO negotiations, and they certainly are trying to advance on this topic, but not as SBTi officially, because our role is to engage with the private sector only.
Thanks.
Thank you for that clarification. With that last question, just to say a big thank you to all the speakers, as well as the participation from our attendees today. We look forward to receiving your feedback and your comments during the public consultation phase, and we encourage you to explore the documents and the target setting tool on our website and submit your comments via the online survey. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, and we look forward to formally launching this project later this year. Thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.